Remember that an atom is made of protons and neutrons in the nucleus and electrons outside of the nucleus. Atoms can gain and lose electrons since they are on the outside of the atom. When they gain or lose an electron, they change their charge. And so you can see here, by losing that electron, lithium got a positive charge. And we call an atom with a charge an ion. It's a positive ion if it has more protons than electrons. It's a negative ion if it has more electrons than protons. Also remember that each different type of atom is called an element. And so here we are looking at the element lithium. If we change the number of protons, we change its name, and now we have the element named beryllium. You'll notice that for this atom, there are two different circles the electrons can be found in, two different orbits. They're not circles in real life, they're spheres, and the electrons are moving randomly around like a crazy buzzing fly. But as you can imagine, it's the electrons in the outside sphere that do the most coming and going between atoms. And so, depending on how many electrons exist in an outside sphere for a certain element, makes it more likely or less likely that that element will form an ion. And it affects whether it's more likely to form a positive ion or a negative ion. It just depends how many electrons are in this outside ring. Remember also that the periodic table is like a family portrait of all the elements, all the different types of atoms. And they're in order by their atomic number noted right here. And that atomic number tells us how many protons are in the atoms. But look, it's a pretty weird shape. Why, for example, is hydrogen with one proton located right over here, and helium with two protons is all the way over here? It turns out that the elements are arranged in this strange shape because their position on the table tells us some things about how they behave. And one of the ways that atoms behave differently is how likely they are to form an ion, and what kind of ion they form most commonly. You are going to do some messing around with information about the types of ions that some of these elements form, and figure out how that information is shown on the periodic table. You have a document showing the most common ion formed by each element. Well, a group of the elements anyway. We're going to focus on some common atoms that make a nice, neat pattern. Let's look at one for a minute. Here is the fluoride ion. You see, it has a little dash next to the F, a little negative sign. That tells you that this ion has one extra electron. Below it, you can see lanthanum, La3+. The 3 plus tells us that lanthanum is positive, which means it tends to lose its electrons, and it tends to lose 3 electrons, so it is 3 positive. Now, some of these elements, like neon here, neon does not make ions very easily, so it doesn't have a charge. It's unlikely to ever gain or lose electrons. And I'll show you one other thing. Look here at the O, which stands for oxygen. Oxygen tends to gain 2 electrons and become a negative ion. But notice that the word here is oxide. By tradition, some atoms get called by a slightly different name when they are ions. So oxygen, when it's neutral, is called oxygen, but it's called oxide when it's an ion. You don't have to worry about knowing that. I just didn't want you to be confused when you saw the different names. You also have a blank periodic table of the elements and a filled-in periodic table of the elements that looks a little nicer than the one I have here. Your task is to figure out where each of these ions would go on the periodic table. You'll use the standard filled-in periodic table to figure out how to put these on your blank periodic table. You can do this several ways. You can cut out the little ion squares and you can glue them when you figure out where they go on or tape them on, or don't glue it. You can just write the ion symbol in the charge, like this. I'll start here with argon. So I see argon. I see its number is 18. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to find where 18 is on the chart. And I'm going to, oh, there we go. 18 is argon. And it's going to go 3 down. 1, 2, 3. So argon. And I'm just going to write 18 argon. Now, I notice here that argon doesn't have any charge. So I'm not going to write any charge next to the argon. But when I go to do one of these others like chloride, it has a negative, and I'm going to be sure to put down a negative next to it when I write it on my periodic table. After you've completed filling in all the ions, you'll be ready to answer questions about the patterns that you find when you start filling this in.